Yeah, hello, I'm George Warner. I'm a research associate at Ruhr-Universität Bochum in Germany, and the book that I wrote last year is The Words of the Imams, al-Shaykh al-Ṣadūq. Yes, the development of 12 Shīʿī Hadith literature. There it is. Yeah, to make Hadith fun. More specifically, slightly, Islam, as much as any religion, is a lot of discussion of it is on big ideas of God and creation and the universe. But as a religion, Islam is also rooted in narratives, in stories of specific places and times in the Middle East in late antiquity. And this is something that I enjoy exploring. And as many people know, when one tries to look into the stories surrounding the origins of Islam, it's not some just neat single narrative. It's this terribly complicated and diffuse thing called hadith, and which is can be very frustrating, but is also complex and fascinating. And so, I wanted to look into hadith. Hadith has often been studied as, in terms of its historicity, in terms of whether this is an accurate record of what actually happened. What I wanted to do is something different, is to look at what kind of relationship to the past, what kind of story is being told here, how it's being told, what it's for. These kind of questions I wanted to throw at the Hadith corpus. And I suppose in terms of working on Shīʿī Hadith, I mean, I had a background in the study of Shīʿī Hadith. I studied, I was lucky enough to study in Sayyida Zainab in Damascus for a year, where I sort of informally sat in on classes in Shīʿī seminaries there. Yes, and so I wanted to look at just the sheerness of Shīʿī Hadith. What is it that makes this particular corpus distinctive? Is it just that there are different sources and they're in different books, or is there more to it? And surprise, surprise, there is more to it. So I wanted to get to the bottom of what makes the 12 Shīʿī relationship to Hadith literature distinctive. And it's not a general introduction. It's a book about one particular figure, but he's an early figure and someone who is present at a very formative moment of the formation of the Shīʿī Hadith corpus in the aftermath of the occultation of the 12th Imam, and that's what led me to Shaykh al-Ṣadūq, who the book is about. Argument's a bit of a strong word, really. I suppose the first thing I contend is something that's sometimes called compilation criticism. The idea that compilers of books of hadith compendia, these are authors in a very important sense. That doesn't mean they're making up the contents, but it means that when a hadith is placed in a compilation, when it is gathered together and put in a book, it acquires meaning. The person who is composing that book has control over how they select hadith, how they arrange hadith, the sort of message which they use collected hadith to communicate to the reader. And so just that basic argument that these are people who we need to take seriously and give due attention and study to, rather than just treating them as, either they're accurately transmitting hadith, in which case they're useful, or they're not, in which case we just get rid of them. So arguing that that's an important approach. And I mean, when it comes to Shaykh al-Ṣadūq, an early 12er hadith compiler, he has all sorts of questions running through his work about his relationship to the Imam and his reader's relationship to the Imam. How does text, how do the rememberings and the recollections of written hadith, is that a substitute for the living Imam who you can go and talk to, or is it not? And these preoccupations suffuse Ṣadūq's compiling of hadith material, and so as he brings them together, and if one pays attention to how these books are collected, one can really see a many-layered deliberation on core questions of Shīʿī thought and Shīʿī relationship to authority and to the Imams, running through Ṣadūq's work. This is most ambitious in the second half of the book, when I really experiment with going through whole books of hadith really systematically and sort of trying to really get a sense of the different parts, the different things they're doing, and how these all relate to one another to create a really complex edifice of meaning that spreads out across hundreds of pages. Yeah, on a more down-to-earth level, this is an intellectual portrait of an early 12th Shīʿī scholar, so it's just trying to, argue for where exactly he sits in 12th Shīʿī tradition, how he relates to other ideas that are going on at the time. In particular, a focus that I wanted the book to have was the relationship between imamology, as it's sometimes called, and jurisprudence. It's important to say that Ṣadūq really represents, he's the first generation of scholars who really begin their scholarly career without there ever having been access to the Imam. So the last emissary of the 12th Imam has died around the time that Ṣadūq becomes active as a scholar, and that means that he has really important questions to answer when it comes to what exactly is the role of hadith literature. In the 9th century, before Ṣadūq's alive, when important Sunni collections like Musnad Ahmad and Sahih Bukhari are written, the Imami Shia still have access to an Imam. They're using hadith, they're talking about hadith, but fundamentally, if they really want to know what the correct answer to a question is, they can go and ask the living Imam. Shaykh Ṣadūq in the 10th century represents the first time that this is really absolutely no longer an option. So it's really a seismic transition for Imami thought, and so looking at, in particular, at how Imami thought relates to and conceives of hadith as a source for truth. So yes, I very much argue the distinctiveness of a Ṣadūq's thought in that regard, and in particular, there is very often when people talk about Muslim scholarship, and certainly pre-modern Muslim scholarship, and nowhere more so than hadith scholarship, there's often a dichotomy between rationalists and traditionists, and that's not inaccurate. There are certainly some Muslim thinkers who are more into independent reason, and other thinkers who are more focused on scripture and the interpretation of it. But there is a real pitfall in that language, in as much as it can lead us into thinking that those scholars like Shaykh Ṣadūq or Ahmad ibn Hanbal are less rational. If they're traditionists, they're not, just because they're traditionists and they have more of a focus on scripture, that does not mean they are not also rational. That does not mean that they're not doing clever and complicated things when they engage with scripture, just as much as people who are more into independent reason, like Mu'tazili theologians, are. So yeah, I in particular tried to argue against that simplifying vision of what a hadith scholar like Ṣadūq is doing, and just again, taking him seriously as a thinker. Just because we don't usually read his own words, we just read the hadith that he's compiling, that doesn't mean that there isn't some really interesting stuff going on beneath the surface of that. The other thing I argue concerns how Ṣadūq's books of hadith relate to their context, not just in terms of Imami Shīʿī theological and legal thought, but the broader cultural and literary setting of which Ṣadūq is part. Many of his books of hadith are really weird if you try and read them as books of straightforward religious instruction that will tell you how to pray and how to fast. Some of them are organized in mad, unhelpful ways, like here are all the hadith with the number 5 in, here are all the hadith with the number 11 in. And other books just contain really strange and apparently unhelpful information about why the earth is called the earth and the sky is called the sky. And so, yeah, what I explore is, given that these are not apparently books of straightforward religious instruction, like some of his books are, what are they doing? And the answer is they're deep in conversation with, most importantly, with what is called adab literature, which is the sort of courtly literature of manners that's a very big part of literary written Arabic in the time that a Ṣadūq is living. And so that's an effort to understand these books and how they work, but it's also showing how Shaykh Ṣadūq is exploring what the Imam's hadith can do. We have now this situation where the Imam needs to be remembered and recollected as texts. What sort of literary space can those texts then inhabit? Where can we take the Imam's hadith? What can we make them do? How can we use them? It's in 2 halves. The first half is called Placing Ṣadūq, and that's really just looking at him in his broad intellectual context, and so talking about his position in Imami jurisprudence, talking about his position in terms of things like adab literature and the court of the Buwayhids, the ruling dynasty where he lived, and that sort of thing. That's the first 3 chapters. The first chapter is a sort of general introduction, and I suppose just, amongst other things, the introduction to the book contains a sort of a basic map of how one might pursue compilation criticism of hadith compendia, the kind of questions one can ask of a book of hadith if one wants to understand what the compiler is doing. So that's in there too. So that's the first half, and then the second half is called Reading al-Ṣadūq, and that's where I undertake these big sustained readings of individual works of his, really trying to, as fully as possible, set out the complexities and nuances of how they work and what he's trying to do in them. Shīʿī Hadith is very much about relating to the Imam, but there are lots of other ways in which Shi'is, both modern and 1,000 years ago, related to their Imam, and I'm trying to expand my view of how that what sort of things go on, and in particular looking at Imam-centered piety and devotion as an important part of the world, of the intellectual project of which al-Ṣadūq is part. So this is looking at things like poems, looking at litanies and liturgies for pilgrimages to the Imam's tombs, and tawassul, asking for the Imam's intercession, and that sort of thing. This stuff is often seen as somehow less serious than theology or law, but it's a huge part of Shi'i religiosity, and indeed Shi'i religious literature as far back as the 10th century and beyond. So just having a look at that again, exploring different accounts of the Imam, and there's lots of things that I'm sort of poking away at there. The one bit I'd really like to become a book is something I've got an article coming out about it soon, but I hope it'll end up being something bigger. And this is a very early Persian epic poem about Imam Ali, which is just it's called the Ali Nameh, and it's just a fascinating, different to Hadith view of a vision of the Imam and the encounter of the believer with the Imam. So I'm hoping to do some more with that.